Okay, so we are presenting on ancestral trauma. I'm Lauren,
I'm Savannah.
And I may.
and here we are.
Yay.
So we wanted to record this in kind of like a podcast style, so we're keeping it conversational as we present all of this. And so we're going to be talking about what is ancestral trauma, group composition, the counseling theories, why a group, session outline, conclusions, all of that kind of thing. But we're going to be discussing it as we go. So, as an introduction to ancestral trauma, in the beginning of studying historical trauma, so there's lots of names for it. There's historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, ancestral trauma, multi-generational trauma. There's lots of words for the same thing. We're going to refer it traditionally as either ancestral trauma or historical trauma. But in the beginning of studying it, they found that they first started studying Jewish Holocaust survivors. Um, and as they were studying Jewish Holocaust survivors and then expanding it, they started to realize that there was slight differences between just trauma that happened to a population versus what became known as more of a ancestral or multi-generational trauma. And a lot of those studies extended into the Irish populations, American Indigenous populations, also Aboriginal populations in Australia, as well as African American populations are, some of the directions that they went with this. But one of the key points is when they focus specifically on colonized populations like the Irish and American Indigenous, as well as the Aboriginal populations, there became a clear distinction between a survivors group, which was more in line with what the Jewish Holocaust survivors were, versus a historical trauma group. And so our focus is on more of that historical trauma group or that multi-generational trauma group. So then we wanted to figure out, okay, who do we want to have inside of this group? Because there's a lot of directions that you can go with this. And so I think May actually was really instrumental in kind of really putting together what would work best for this group. So do you want to say a little bit about that, May, like why you thought it might work really well for women?
Yeah, I thought about doing most focusing on women because women throughout history have been silenced a lot, and we carry a lot of ancestral trauma that hasn't been brought up and hasn't been focused on. And so I believe that this would be like a great space for women to feel safe and be able to dig further into that. There was throughout history a lot of women were silenced and killed and didn't really have a voice. And so we've always heard history but never her story. And so I felt like this would be an appropriate place to give a voice to women to be able to dive more deeply into that. So our target population is women who are willing to participate in an exploration of their ancestry and who feel they have experienced historical trauma. We are looking for diversity in age, culture, and experiences. And so, a question we have you felt like you have ever experienced trauma that's beyond you?
And I thought she has told a really interesting story about your own uh family's history or your own culture's history, May, about women. And I don't know if you'd be willing to share that, but I think it's something interesting to talk about that's relevant to this.
Yeah, when I was in Iran this past summer, I mean, not this past summer, 2 months ago, I spoke with my cousins about this, but my my grandmother was, she came from a royal bloodline, but she wasn't allowed to even go to first grade. And my mom wasn't allowed to go beyond high school, and her high school was a technical high school. And for me, I'm here getting my master's degree. And that for me, like I believe that I'm breaking generational curses, and that for me is ancestral trauma. And going further back in our history, um, it's my great 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 grandmother. She was the medicine woman of our village,
Yeah.
and she was revered, and like she was a doctor with no education, but she was the doctor, and everybody would go to her, and she was the midwife, and she was the healer, and she practiced medicine and herbs. And to go from that to not being able to go to school, that in itself is a silencing for women. And so, yeah.
Yeah, that's, that gives me chills thinking about. And I think that that's like also a really important piece for us to really address, as well as like ancestral trauma can have many symptoms and be experienced in a lot of different ways. Um, so some of the adverse correlates of ancestral trauma are unremitting grief, self-directed violence, depression and anxiety, body dysmorphia, internalized marginalization, alcoholism and substance abuse, sexual trauma, deep silencing, as May mentioned, cultural genocide, the loss of traditional values, desecration of land and institutions, leadership crisis, and a conspiracy of silence, which leads to an overall attitude of secrecy. And I know even for myself and my background, an Irish diaspora, which means that my ancestors literally on one side of my family escaped on coffin ships because of quite literal genocide that, is like painted as like, oh, the potato famine was just this thing that happened. Like, no, it was an active genocide that was happening. And on one side, they had to escape on coffin ships is the only way to potentially save themselves. And so they went to Canada. And then on the other side of my family, they stayed in Ireland until the 1920s, but were a part of the, you know, revolution essentially of Ireland and liberation of Ireland and had to escape for, political reasons. And one of those, aspects of that comes up is alcoholism, substance abuse. There's a lot of things that trickle down through the family on both sides because of that. But loss of language is also a big piece of that. And so luckily that part is coming back. But, those are just some of the things that come up around that. Is there anything on any of that that you want to add, Savannah?
No, yeah, I think those are really good points. This overall attitude of secrecy that kind of can come along with a lot of that is a way of like losing contact with your all the cultural aspects, religion, philosophy, spirituality, your cultural practices of language, even yeah, like even the way the family system is organized, education, all that.
Yeah, that's a really good point about the family systems and the organization of that. Um, so now, of course, we have to get into some of the theory aspects of it. So there's the narrative and humanistic theory. So the narrative theory that really examines how our clients view their lives and how their locations influence their perspectives, including a social construct perspective, kind of like what Savannah was alluding to about the families. Um, but then using exercises such as the Tree of Life. And so one can look at their life from a wider perspective and choice of, fully oriented in a new direction and blending that spirituality and health with the community is really important to rewrite or be able to sit in what the story is, but also be able to rewrite a new story, blending those traditional values in with the community to rewrite what the new story is moving forward for a community that's gone through ancestral trauma. Psychoanalysis extermination theory. So this came up a lot in the studies as far as like when you start to lean into epigenetics and the epigenetic changes that happen from multi-generational trauma. The extermination theory actually comes up as something that builds into post-traumatic growth and resilience. And so working with those unconscious beliefs, habitual behaviors, and family patterns as a member of the group offers an opportunity for a fresh understanding of one's experience, feelings, and beliefs that can become the foundation for positive change. And then, of course, Gestalt. All three of us have learned to love Gestalt and what it has to offer. And so that focus on the here and now and the group members' innate wisdom to bring forth exactly what they are ready to meet with within themselves in an ancestral perspective, but again, as a present person moving forward for the community.
Mm.
Now we're going to look at why do this work in a group. And the first thing we want to focus on is that it brings an installation of hope. So the therapist is able to reinforce positive expectations, correct negative preconceptions, and present a lucid, powerful explanation of the group's healing properties tied specifically to an accessible and culturally resonant explanation of client difficulties. Also, there's universality. When members share their experiences, feelings, and beliefs, they will find that others share the same ones, which can bring great relief because they realize they're not alone. A lot of these experiences we have with ancestral trauma are shared amongst many different cultures. They're not just shared within one specific culture. There's a lot of universality that comes with it. There's also altruism, so group members will be able to offer each other support through their feedback, suggestions, reassurances, encouragement, and attuned listening. This brings humanness to it. It allows being altruistic to other group members, support growth in the giver, and then also imparting information. As group members learn about ancestral trauma, the associated symptoms, comorbidities, and ways of working with their inner resiliency, positive changes can come.
Yeah, I think this is important too, and especially like with the universality, like I was just reading something too about if your ancestors were the oppressors, not just the oppressed, but the ancestors of those that were oppressors too, like what ancestral trauma had to be in place for a people to become like that, or to do those kinds of things. So I think it's a really important aspect of that as
Mhm.
well.
I like that you bring that up, Lauren. Um, just because there's a topic of conversation I always bring up in my household and amongst my family and friends, and that's every group has had their own privilege in a different way. And
Yeah.
so even the oppressor, like I've brought up some things within my friend group and stuff that I'm like, you guys talk about white privilege, but there's a lot of things I didn't have to experience that a lot of people growing up here experienced because no matter how much struggle and strife I went through, like my mom cooked me 3 meals a day. That's a privilege right there.
Yeah.
And as the oppressed, I see a lot of people within the oppressor that like were aren't they don't they're not able to have that privilege. They don't know what it's like to sit at a family meal. And so there's it is very universal. Like I like how you brought that up.
Mhm. Yeah, that's neat. I think that the other thing that I love about these curative factors too is that the research supports all this, like the installation of hope, um, psychoeducation, all these things of better understanding of our common shared humanity, essentially, along with like kind of understanding the story and like reframing it, are all ways that can benefit those with it's like in the research on ancestral trauma specifically that these things do really make a difference for people.
Yeah.
Why work together exactly?
Yeah, so I think, we kind of addressed this, but it's interesting to yeah, work together.
Yeah, I was struck too, like Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart has done so many studies on ancestral trauma specifically. So if you're interested in more, that's a good person to look up.
Yeah, she's done some amazing studies. She was like one of the first people to really dive into it specifically with Lakota tribal members, but expanding that out. And a lot of the research that she was initially doing also bridged into what was happening in Northern Ireland. So then that kind of bridged the gap between the groups for them to learn from each other. And I think, opening this door of ancestral trauma really, and historical trauma really leans into that, as just like you were talking about before, is, finding those commonalities.
All right, so now we're going to go on to our first session. Um, I'm just going to go through the bullet points and then we'll all jump in different places. But so for the first session, we would spend the first 15 minutes on an introduction icebreaker, introductions, and purpose. And our introduction would include going around and asking our group, asking everyone what their name is, introducing themselves, and then who they live with. And then we would discuss what is ancestral or historical trauma. After that, there would be a cultural renewal exercise. What do you know about your heritage or family ancestors? And then group sharing for cultural renewal, psychoeducation, and homework. We would spend 5 minutes on a Qigong brushing practice. And then the closing would be demonstration of cultural renewal practice by the facilitators, and we would leave time for questions.
So one of the things about the that's up in the research is like how important cultural renewal is to like start to reconnect with your cultural heritage. And so I think that's part of why we decided to start with this cultural renewal, which is just like getting to know more about your heritage and like the practices of your ancestors. Um, so in a way, it's kind of like providing some ground for like who you are and kind of reframing like your, I don't know if it's identity is the right word, but more like giving you some ground. And then like within kind of a theme throughout our all of our sessions is kind of this reconnecting with ourselves somatically and becoming more embodied. So even in the if you look into our like detailed session plans in our document that you can look at separately, there's this a little bit of movement like even in the introduction and then at the end too, so that we can continue to like start to even like begin for some people to connect with ourselves in a more embodied way. And then we thought that May has a cultural renewal experience or practice. Um, because what the idea is that at the be there'll be a cultural renewal practice shared by each by a group member at the beginning of each session. So this first session would end with May sharing or the facilitator sharing a cultural renewal practice to offer an example of what that might look like.
Yeah, and I can get into that. So, a cultural renewal practice that I have had for a very long time. In our culture, our monthly cycle, our menstrual cycle is very revered. We believe that that is the one time in the month when our body is flushing out all toxins, all negativities, it's just a cleansing. We see it as a cleansing. And we call it it's like our moon cycle because we believe that it goes with the moon. And this is an old tradition that we've carried throughout all of the wars, all of the religious changes within our culture. This is something that's like a word of mouth that mothers teach their daughters. And my mom taught me when I had my first monthly cycle, and at the end of the week when my period was completely over, she took me to the shower and she said, "Okay, every month when we get our period, as our body flushes everything out, it's a mental, emotional, and spiritual cleanse." And so we go in the shower, and this is a very like earth-centered, ground-centered, using the four elements to cleanse ourselves. And so she taught me that we go in the shower, and as we're standing under the running water, we set our intention first. And so my intention has always been patience, an open heart, and understanding. And so after we set our intention, we run the water from the middle of our from the beginning of our forehead to the end. And then we start with our right side, and we run the water from our right shoulder down to our right fingertips. And I know I'm doing this backwards on the camera, but then we go from our shoulder down to our belly button. And then we go from the top of our legs down to our toes. And then we start on the left side, and we do the same on the left. And we run the water from our shoulder down to the tip of our fingers, up from our shoulder down to our belly button. We clean our privates, and then we go down to our left toes. And then we stand under the water, the running water, and we just have a moment. We give ourselves a very spiritual, peaceful moment where the mind, the heart, the soul have space to connect. And just talking about it right now brings me peace because it's very intentional. It's very intentional, and it's a regular practice. We do it once a month. So yeah.
Yeah, I love that. It's like a perfect one to share with women, as a
Mhm.
since this is a female historical trauma circle, it's really perfect for that.
And I see a lot of importance in it because like our periods are like they're not revered anymore. Like it's kind of like ew.
Yeah.
And here like it's not ew. It's oh like
Mhm.
it has a purpose.
Mhm.
Right. Yeah. That's a perfect example of that historical trauma, right? Of like
Mhm.
that there's a something, I don't even want to say like gross or something, but something's wrong or off or, you
Mhm.
know,
Yeah.
there's shame. Shame. There's that shame there around something that's innately a part of being female.
Yeah, shame. It's like the foundation of who you are.
And it's also interesting for me that this practice is it's not written anywhere. It's not part of any book. It's not part of any but within our culture all the girls know it because their moms teach them. And to be able to have kept such an old practice for so long through mother to daughter, mother to daughter, mother to daughter.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, that's such a beautiful thing about like doing cultural renewal too, is for acknowledging that that is indeed like an important tradition and how it is passed along, and so it kind of brings in responsibility, but also for those of us who to like reflect on what we have had and but also like what we want to kind of bring back from our culture that's been missing for
Hmm.
us, and then that we can like start it anew. Um, and so part of like the next step is for the homework for after this first session actually is to like um, make a 4 generation family tree in preparation for the next session, which is when we'd be making genograms in session 2.
Do you want to talk
So
about that? Yeah.
yeah, these are just examples of genograms. So in the family tree, it's just like, these are my parents, these are their parents and their siblings, and just a really simple family tree. But the genogram gets into some more specifics, and you can look at it in different ways. And you're kind of you can use it to find family patterns, and that could help you look for where there might be trauma or patterns that might be from trauma. Like you could look at addiction, mental health issues, and it's hard to see, I know, on this thing, but there you can talk about sudden deaths or accidents or different kinds of relationships, abusive relationships, disrupted relationships like divorce, or um, there's just like a lot of different options of ways to look at patterning throughout your family history. And um, so if you can do that for 4 generations, you might get an idea of some ways that there's disruption, but also ways that there's resilience. Like how has your family thrived and come to where you are, which is, part of being resilient, that you have that you're here, even though you have had trauma and have had some things happen, whatever they may be, is specific to your family and your lineage. So in the second session, we would start by having the group members share their cultural renewal practice, whoever is the first. And like May shared, it could be something that is um, a practice like that. It could also be like a prayer that's said every day in a mealtime, or it could be a meal, even like some sort of traditional meal. It could be a way that you celebrate, or a way that you mourn, or it could be a song, that it could be a poem. I mean, it's like so wide open. So it's really up to the person and to what they want to share, or they could even find something that if they don't have one, they could research one. And then we would talk about that and go over the purpose of the session, which is in making genograms and looking for family patterns. And we would discuss that too, like, so there'd be time and supplies provided to do that, with guides and such, like the one that's on this slide, but also discussing that, like what was it like to look for your 4 generations to make the family tree? Like, could you do that? And just like bring in some of that here and now experience too. Like, how is it to share this with the group? What are you noticing in yourself? And I imagine that, it's possible to have a range of experience. Some people might not be able to find much about one side of their family or both sides, or they might have some difficult um, history that's hard to acknowledge or be with. So, um, yeah. And then we would then at the end pick the next person to do the cultural renewal for the third session, and kind of a summarizing and what's coming up next. And if there's time, do the same a qigong brushing practice, which um, yeah, there's detail in also our Google Doc about that.
I think this one is really important too. Like you touched on the, not being able to find potentially family for 4 generations and what that really looks like. You know, like I know in my own family, trying to find 4 generations was pretty hard. And and then also a part of that brings something up for me, at least in my own family, was that who was doing those censuses, you know? And like they considered the women as like not important. So a lot of times they would record the males, but not record the females of or their names or who their parents' names were. So they would record the man of the family's parents' names, but they wouldn't record the women's of the family's parents' names except for the father and not the mother. Like it didn't matter. And even though in our history, women were equal to men, they weren't less than, they were the same, they were just different. And so, but as that colonization happened, then that pattern changed, of that those roles changed and who was recording that information, what their biases were in that. So it brings up a lot of interesting things as far as how far back you can even go. I mean, can't go back that far, you know, except for certain lines. And so yeah.
Yeah, yeah, really good points. The, the third session's going to be focused on disenfranchised grief. We'll still start with the cultural renewal sharing, so it'd be the person who was selected, and then there's always time to like share and talk about that. And then we also wanted to make sure to check in, like, what was it? How was it during the time in between sessions, for everyone? Were there kind of like, what were the reverberations of doing the genogram and the family tree work? As they might have noticed some new patterns, some things they weren't aware of, or that they didn't have enough information to do very extensive genogram, or they didn't know a lot about, their relatives, and the relationships, or that's part of like the silencing actually, is like not necessarily knowing what your relationships were like in between your parents and their siblings or whatever it may have been. Um, and then, yeah, this idea of, and then going into like psychoeducation on disenfranchised grief and shame, and then sharing and checking in as after hearing about disenfranchised grief. So disenfranchised grief is like grief that isn't like socially acceptable, or like even it could be like your own internalization of what's acceptable for grieving, or what's acceptable to even feel sad about as a loss. Like, and one example could be like, oh, say I had like a pet lizard and it died, and people are like, why do you care about a lizard? And so you don't feel like maybe that relationship is valid, or and so you don't feel like you can grieve the loss of your lizard, whereas like maybe a dog might be more acceptable thing to grieve, or a relative or something. So it's just kind of about grief that doesn't feel welcomed to feel. And within that, because of that, you can have shame, and shame is just like a suppressing of that, and a hiding of it. And um, it can show up in so many different ways.
Yeah, I
Um,
wanted to say something else about that disenfranchised grief too, because so a lot of what happens is that the amount of grief as a culture or as a community is so great that it's beyond speaking about. And so it leads to that deep silencing, as you were mentioning, where it's just like the grief is so huge, it's beyond speaking about. And so then it becomes silence. It's just as quiet. Like you don't talk about anything. So, like anything that's related to that. And then the after effect becomes this cultural shame. And so there's a lot of things that come out of that cultural shame. Um, which can lead to the culture itself suppressing its own self. So, suppressing its own culture, its own language, its own pride, its own, there's a lot that goes on with that. And then it kind of is interesting, I think, because it can lead to, a concept that we had in one of our other classes, which is this concept of what they call idiot compassion. So it's like you end up like trying to wanting the culture itself will try to like save everyone else around them and have compassion for everyone else around them, but won't have that same capacity for itself and for its own compassion and its own kindness. But it will have, exponential compassion for another disenfranchised group, right? And fight like hell for them, but will have condemnation for itself. So there's a really interesting nuance of factors that come in around that. So I just wanted to add that in there because it's a really, really important piece that often gets, I feel like, not addressed exactly.
yeah, that's so good, Lauren. Love your explanation of that. So with that kind of like all of that in mind, like part of it is bringing out, um, starting to like kind of make contact with the the grief, the shame. And so doing like a mindfulness expression with art therapy. So we'd provide the supplies and kind of like guide them into the members into like contacting themselves, and then letting that, um, whatever they might come up for them, like what they might feel grief in, or some sort of disconnection or shame, even whatever shows up. and then just like kind of let that come out through their body into an art piece essentially, and then talk about that afterwards. And um, yeah, and then close. And then like I think this would be like an ongoing part of this group would be engaging with disenfranchised grief while doing cultural renewal practices. So these would be like these are like major themes that we brought up in the first three sessions that would continue on.
So in conclusion, the three components of healing and working with ancestral trauma. First, it allows for a connection between spiritual and psychological. Um, Second, it allows to facilitate multi-generational connection. And third, it allows for cultural sensibility and awareness. It brings voice to the silenced experience and helps facilitate community healing. It allows connection to ancestors, helping bring awareness to personal stories, community stories, cultural connection, and facilitating the creation of a new community story. And I believe in like today's time and age, especially here in America, where we have so many different blending cultures, it allows culture to also be created. It allows a new connection in this new world we're living in where we're not separated anymore. We're all being brought together. And so if we can all voice our experiences and the things we've learned and the things we've had, then we can create this like I had a history professor that would say America is not a melting pot, it's a salad. And I feel like it kind of allows us to facilitate that, where we have this salad where we can all learn these really interesting practices and create something new, something beautiful, something where there's no voices being silenced, but instead we have a place to share and to, bring our grief, bring everything out to the open, create connection, and then create something new together where we don't have to be going through trauma anymore. It helps end generational curses, in my opinion, and create something new.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
I
love
love that salad.
yeah, I like that too, salad. And I think too, like I forget myself that America is a culture and
Mm-hmm.
it's a culture that's in the process of being created.
Mm-hmm.
And that yes, we can appreciate what our ancestral culture is, but yeah, I love that idea of like bringing those like beautiful cultural elements together to create that American culture that's much more enriched, than rather separated, I suppose. And yeah, that just like triggered something within me of like, oh yeah, thinking of how those elements can be brought together and shared in such a beautiful way, but yet retained,
Well,
um, preserved, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
that makes me remember we have some stories that we're told when we're little kids. And these stories aren't written anywhere. They're just, like our moms have them memorized. I have them memorized for my kid. And they're just spoken word stories but they have very strong morals. And lately, this thought's been going through my head where I'm like, you know what? I want to create children's books and put these stories in there. And why not?
Yeah.
Yeah, why not?
Why not?
Yeah.
Because, like, for us in these stories, we're taught something beyond fight or flight
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to like trauma. And I feel like those made me stronger learning these stories. And why not put them in books? Like, why? There doesn't need to be the silence and secrecy anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's an evolution of how we share our, yeah, our cultural knowledge, our traditions and stuff.
Hmm.
The oral, maybe to the written. Yeah. That's cool, May.
And then back to oral, because, right, in children's books, a lot of times it's read aloud.
Yeah.
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 Um, Yeah, that made me think of too, like I was just reading in a book this morning where they were talking about most Europeans that came here, including the English, who were primarily the colonizers, right? They were the primary colonizers of the US. They also were fleeing. Like they were talking about like the Puritans and, like what was English culture back
Hmm.
in the day. And it was rough, And so a lot of people there were fleeing, but like a lot of people that came to the US because of fleeing, which is a fight or flight.
Oh,
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it just reminds me of like the things that no matter what cultural background you come from, there's a certain commonality in all of that too.
Hmm.
Yeah, bringing that back into story. I love it.
yeah.
Yeah, the research too for on ancestral trauma is really also about the how important it is to tell the stories. So to talk about like your family and your part of doing those different practices with the family tree and the genogram and like researching your ancestry is to be able to talk about your stories, even from your own parent to you, and what's been shared there is important to tell and talk about, just to continue to bring out the stories as part of as like a cultural renewal practice.
I think you
Talking.
mentioned too that that was helpful for you, right, Savannah? Because you at first you were kind of like, I don't even know what my family's history or story is or whatever.
Yeah, like just starting to like get curious about especially for someone like me. I have like quite a diverse background and like um of Western Northern European ancestry. So yeah, it's like we don't have a clear practice, or I don't have a clear heritage culture. And in some ways, like I was more influenced by my stepdad's Chinese culture. Um, but also like in a way, I've kind of thought about what do I want to create more with my children, but at the same time, I find myself coming back to like my Catholic heritage, like the Catholic theme in my family. There's a lot of like comfort in that, even though like there's parts of that I don't want, but there's also parts of it that I do want, and it does, I do have like a felt sense of the connection with my ancestors because of that. So that's been interesting, and it's been new for me to connect with.
Yeah, that's beautiful, actually.
Yeah.
There's that spiritual element that ties in, you know?
Yeah. And like connecting, we could talk about this for ages, but you can like connecting with the land too, and like connecting with the land where you are now, or connecting with the land and like different, plants and animals and whatever kind of energies and stuff from the land that you might be most drawn toward, or yeah, different ways of connecting and um, reconnecting relationships too with the land, but also through, I don't know, it's like then it brings into like more of the spiritual aspect too, of like connecting with your ancestors who have passed through the land or through ritual and such.
When you bring that up, Savannah, it reminds me of my rugs in my living room.
Yeah.
It says all of the dyes used are all natural minerals and they come from fruits and plants. And so I always tell people no matter where I go in the world, I walk on my land. And that's just a part of my ancestry and my culture. And it's been a very long practice. And it's interesting for me that you like it reminded me of that because I like no matter what, I get to hold on to a piece of my past. So
Yeah. You've shared so many cool things about the rugs before, May, too. So it's like really sweet to hear another element of that.
Yeah.
it's my family's business.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Better.
Yeah, this has helped me too, as far as like researching all of this, because I kind of like got deeply into it right around the end of January, and the beginning of February, the 1st of February, is Imbolc, which is the traditional Irish celebration of bringing in the spring. So everyone knows about Halloween, right? That's actually a traditionally Irish holiday. But Imbolc is like bringing in the spring. So instead of like, uh, so it's like the celebration of flowers, the days getting lighter and longer, and the goddess of that is Brigid. And of course the the church wanted to incorporate as much of the traditional beliefs in as possible so that they would, kind of like meld together. And so Brigid became a saint. And so there was a traditional celebration of creating these designs out of reeds that eventually became called Brigid's crosses. And so, bringing in those like elements of like connecting to the land, weaving, and creating those designs with the reeds and putting it up in the highest part of your home each year, to basically wish good luck and well-being to your home and health and safety to everyone in your home as a part of it. So yeah, even just like this reconnection kind of brought me back into that practice and bringing that back into my family's, connection with culture. It's really, yeah, powerful stuff.
Oh,
Rich. Yeah, that's really cool. Thank you, everybody.
thank you all.
Yeah, thanks for joining us on here.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna stop recording now. I hope.